Welcome to the Shared Path. I'm Maggie Linton. How many of you have seen the blockbuster movie, The Dirty Dozen? Well, today we're going to talk about the making of this wonderful movie with New York Times bestselling author Dwayne Epstein with his latest book, Killing Generals, The Making of the Dirty Dozen, the most iconic World War II movie of all time. Welcome, Dwayne.
Thank you, Maggie. I appreciate it.
Well, we met years ago when you did a book on Lee Marvin, who is a very much a part of the Dirty Dozen. In fact,
Indeed.
I'd say pretty much the lead guy.
Yeah, he was the lead. Absolutely, he was.
Yeah, yeah.
And when we spoke back when you were with NPR, I would venture a guess you helped get it on the New York Times bestsellers list.
Oh, really?
It went to number 4, which is quite an accomplishment for a first major book.
Yeah.
And so I
But
thank you for it.
oh, it's truly my pleasure. Well, I'm glad you got in touch with me with this one because I think as I told you that the day you got in touch with me, some friends and I were sitting around on Memorial Day
Perfect.
and we were watching The Dirty Dozen. And a
Of
couple weeks
course.
later, you got in contact with me and you said, "Are you interested?" And I said, "Absolutely." Because as we were sitting there, we'd forgotten all the true stars that were in there. And the making of the movie, it turned out to be really fascinating.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Yeah.
was it because of Lee Marvin and you knowing about him that you got interested in this? How did this all come about?
Well, it's interesting because that yes, the short answer is definitely yes. And what you said a moment ago about the amount of stars that were in the movie, not everybody in the cast at the time the film was in production was necessarily a star. They were working actors, almost all of them, but the trajectory of the film's success made them all major stars. And I mean, almost to a person, everybody. And that shows you the level of popularity of the film. Um, but in terms of how I came about to do this, it's number well, yes, it was a result in many ways of the book I did, the bio I did on Lee Marvin, fascinating man, and I had gotten a new agent, a gentleman by the name of Lee Sobel, and I hadn't really done anything of any worth since the Lee Marvin book came out, and I've been working on several ideas, but my previous agent had passed away, so I was kind of in free fall. So my agent Lee Sobel called me, he contacted me out of nowhere, having read the Lee Marvin book, and he asked me if I need an agent. And I said, that, yeah, I didn't know it was done that way. I always thought you had to search for an agent. He came to me. So I looked him up and I checked him out. And when he seemed legit, we talked. And then we started talking about possible projects. And he presented several books on the making of certain films. And he asked me if I'd be interested in doing a book on a Lee Marvin film that was popular or has a legacy. And the first one he mentioned was Point Blank. Now, that's a movie I like, but it's not a movie I love. So
Yeah.
when he said a Lee Marvin movie and said Point Blank, I said, how about The Dirty Dozen? And he went, that might work. Put something together, get me a proposal, and I'll put it out there. And that's exactly what happened. And we got a turnaround that was amazing. Sometimes you could wait weeks, months, sometimes even a year or longer to get a publisher to go thumbs up or thumbs down. He got one in about a week. And Kensington Press, the editor there, a gentleman by the name of Gary Goldstein, luckily was a huge Dirty Dozen fan. He loved the idea, loved the proposal, and we took it from there. The only drawback was that I had a very small window of time to research and write the book. Usually you get anywhere from a year to 2 years, depending on the subject matter. But I had like 9 months. I really had to hit the ground running. Luckily, a lot of the research I did on the Lee Marvin book wasn't all put into the Lee Marvin book in terms of his work on the Dirty Dozen. So I had a lot of leftover archives on that. And as a writer, I'm a pack rat. You never throw anything away. And I kept everything I had, including some wonderful interviews with gentlemen who are no longer with us. So I was able to get that level of exclusivity. And one of the best things I got was a lady I know, a friend of mine, who's also a nonfiction film writer, wrote a book about the making of The Graduate called Seduced by Mrs. Robinson. Her name is Beverly Gray. And when I told her what I was working on, she mentioned to me that she had interviewed the author of the original novel, The Dirty Dozen. that gentleman passed away in 2016. His name was Mick Nathanson. She asked me if I wanted the interview since it never got published. I went, Beverly, I would love that interview. So that was another one of the exclusives I was able to get. And and I like to tell people this, because the movie came out over 50 years ago, not a whole lot of people involved in the film are around anymore. One of the people that is still around is a gentleman named Ken Hyman, who was the producer of the film. And I didn't know if he was alive or dead, and I know he was off the grid since he's 93 years old, and it took a while to find him, but eventually, through a lot of digging, I did find him. And he lives in London. He's 93 years old, and he gave me some wonderful anecdotes about the making of the movie that, once again, nobody knew. There's a lot of great exclusives in the book. And when it came to finding Ken Hyman, I like to tell people, how come there's no famous Jewish detectives? I found them.
Yes, you did.
Anyway.
Yes, you did. I tell you that it was interesting when you mentioned Nathanson and realizing that he was the movie was the book was the nemesis for the movie. And
right.
But yet there were changes that were made, and a lot of it was going after the cast of characters that really helped pump it up. But also, they changed directors before it actually got off onto the screen.
Well, no, they never. Well, yeah, I take that back. I'm sorry. They did change directors. I keep thinking about Ken Hyman, who, when he came on board, he only wanted Robert Aldrich to direct it. But you're right about that, in that Ken Hyman wasn't even the original producer. There was another producer, director, screenwriting team, and they all, bailed. And the screenplay itself was actually revised several times. There were several versions besides later revisions. But when Ken Hyman came on board, he only wanted Robert Aldrich to be the director, even though he told me that if Aldrich wasn't available, he did have a possible backup, and that would have been, believe it or not, Sam Peckinpah. Yeah, I know.
It would have had even more violence in it then,
absolutely right. Although, to be honest, yeah, most certainly. But to be honest with you, Robert Aldrich never shied from making some films pretty violent. Probably the most being in The Dirty Dozen. And there's there's an urban legend, a rumor that Robert Aldrich should have gotten an Oscar nomination for The Dirty Dozen, but didn't, because he wouldn't change the ending. They wanted, producers in Hollywood and what have you, wanted, if he'd have made the ending less violent, he would have gotten an Oscar nomination. I can tell you for a fact that's not true. Ken Hyman told me that's not true. He said he'd been hearing that for years, and he doesn't know where that came from. But that's not why he didn't get an Oscar nomination. He didn't get an Oscar nomination for that movie simply because the Hollywood establishment didn't like Aldrich, and he didn't like the Hollywood establishment. He was the classic rebel, misfit, maverick, but he got to make his own movies his own way. And if that meant not making changes, so be it. Not that that was ever even a factor. It's just that he stuck by his guns, and that's how it was going to be. And Hollywood said, okay, no, no two ways about it. And consequently, The Dirty Dozen was in 1967, which was the year of The Graduate, Cool Hand Luke, Bonnie and Clyde, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, In the Heat of the Night, all these groundbreaking films. Of all of them, The Dirty Dozen was the biggest hit of the year. It made more money than all the other films I mentioned. And
it was like you said, it started out a sleeper, or not getting much support by the studios or anything else. But boy, did it just knock it out of the park once people got there. It became a cult kind of underground hit, but then it just continued to boil and come up.
Well, the thing is, the studio, MGM, didn't shy away from the film. They backed it, and they gave it a really good build-up. And it wasn't even, a sleeper, which is a movie by definition that's a surprise hit. That people are sleeping when you see how big a hit it's become. The thing about The Dirty Dozen, MGM expected it to be successful. They just didn't. They weren't aware of how successful it would become. It blew the doors off all of the expectation. And even, if you don't mind me saying this, even Mick Nathanson said that to me, and I guess you could bleep this, but he said, well, not to me, to Beverly Gray. When the numbers came in, it really saved MGM. And he said, McNathanson said, the Dirty Dozen saved MGM's ass because they were in the red, and they just made more money the quarter and following year that the Dirty Dozen was released. It was a monster hit, and it continued to be into. And Robert Aldrich was the one who made the connection about it. You know, the release of the film and the theme was kind of a perfect storm. If you remember, 1967 it came out in the summer of '67, I think. But you know, the Vietnam War was escalating. There was political unrest in this country. There was civil unrest in this country, and there were all kinds of things going on, and also in the rest of the world. The earliest demonstrations and protests against Vietnam were actually coming out of France, the French students, and all of these things combined in '67 and into '68, because the film was still playing in theaters, helped to create this massive groundswell of interest in the film. So, you know, and there were people at that time period who were World War II veterans, still very much around. They were probably in their 40s or 50s, and they loved the film. And younger, possible, you know, draftees for the time period, those who were protesting the war and those who were about to go overseas, they loved the film for, you know, a myriad of reasons. The themes that are in it, the style in which it was done. So it couldn't help but be a hit. And Aldrich had said, I'd be a fool if I told you I knew that was going to happen. You know, nobody could predict the events of '67 and how it all congealed to make the Dirty Dozen a monster hit.
Let's begin with, because I know assuming most people, I won't say everyone, has seen The Dirty Dozen. Explain the premise behind it.
Oh,
That's, I
absolutely. Yeah.
mean, like I said, I mean, I can remember it coming out, and I can't tell you how many times I've seen it since then. That's number one. And number
Mm-hmm.
two, how it turned out to be important that so many of the lead actors had actually been in the military.
Yeah, in one way or
And so
another.
their understanding of protocol really made a difference also.
Oh, absolutely. And it made for some interesting debating while the film was being made. Probably the one with the most illustrious military career was Lee Marvin. He was a Marine during World War II. He fought in the Pacific. He was wounded in the Pacific. He was also decorated. He made 21 landings with the Marines, and he was wounded on Saipan. But also, Charles Bronson was in the United States Army Air Corps. Clint Walker was a merchant marine. Richard Jacob was in the Army. Ernest Borgnine was in the Navy. Robert Ryan was also in the Marines. He was a drill instructor. Not a drill instructor. He was a weapons instructor. Um, Robert Aldridge would have gone into the service as well, except when he was in college, he was playing football and he injured his knee, permanently. So he wasn't viable. Ken Hyman, the producer of the film, was in the Marines and he was a corporal. And because Lee Marvin never rose above the rank of private, he told him, "Look, I'm going to outrank you on this," in anything they ever did. But yeah, so that acumen, that background, that played a part. Real quick anecdote: when they were doing the table read, when they all first gathered around the table to do the first rehearsal, Lee Marvin and Charles Bronson got into an argument because there was a line of dialogue from the beginning of the film that when the dozen all line up, the line is, "All right, parade right," and they're all supposed to look to they're all supposed to look to the right. There was an advisor there and he was the one who gave him the line, and Bronson apparently said, "No, it's not parade right. When I was in the Army, it was parade left." And Lee Marvin said, "When I was in the Marines, it was parade right." And then they started arguing back and forth about it. And Robert Aldridge let it go for a certain period of time until he finally. Robert Aldridge had a head like a bulldog, and he was a big man. And when they were arguing, he stuck his head between them and he goes, "I don't care if it's parade right or parade left. You do it the way we tell you to do it. Now shut up." That was the end of it. For all these tough guys' attitude and personality, when it came to the final say, not only was Robert Aldridge the director, but everybody backed down because he had a reputation. Don't mess with him. And so he could keep Lee Marvin and Charles Bronson at bay. Um, you asked about the premise. It's interesting because it was a work of fiction. That's another urban legend about the film, was that it was based on a true story. No, it's not. There were aspects of it that were possibly true, but Mick Nathanson was able to say, and he said it every time he was interviewed, it was absolutely a work of fiction. It was not based on any actual event in which the military, approached 12 convicted criminals in the service for really, really heinous crimes: murder, rape, in some cases, multiple murders, what have you, and and recruited them for a secret mission with the possibility of amnesty. Now that never happened. And where Nathanson got the idea for the story was that, and I love this connection, he had a very good friend by the name of Russ Meyer. Now, I don't know if your listeners are familiar with who Russ Meyer was, but he was known as the king of sexploitation. He made some of those wonderful big breasted women movies in the 60s and 70s. But he was also, when he was younger, he was a combat photographer during World War II. And as a combat photographer, he worked in a unit that was overseen by General Patton. He was ordered to go to a military prison and photograph a bunch of gentlemen who were prisoners, and there were 12 prisoners who were going to be assigned to be trained and sent overseas for a suicide mission. And he took those photos, and then he turned them in. And when he went back to find out later what happened to them, his CO said, "I'll look into it." Found out that they didn't exist. And he told that story to Mick Nathanson. And Mick Nathanson's response was, "The hackles on the back of my neck went up." He said, "What an amazing story." And he was working on something else at the time, but he decided, "I'm going to drop it. I'm going to work on this." Now, he, and with the help of Russ Meyer, spent 2 years trying to find out what happened to the so-called Dirty Dozen that Russ Meyer photographed. Now, I'm not saying Russ Meyer was necessarily lying or making stuff up. He just maybe misremembered exactly the details of what he was required to do. So consequently, after not being able to find anything he needed, Nathanson decided, "I'm still going to write the story, but I'm going to make it a work of fiction." And the research he had done, which included going over transcripts of convicted criminals and their trials and all kinds of other things, he took that information, and with the help of several professional military psychiatrists, and funneled it into the work of creating the book, The Dirty Dozen. And that's how it came about. And it went from there. He also said, too, that over the years, even after the book came out, and especially when the movie came out, he would get calls from people saying, "Oh, yeah, I was a member of the Dirty Dozen," or "I flew the plane that the dozen on," and photographed them.
Crazy, isn't it? Very, very crazy. All right, let's go ahead. You give so many little anecdotes and tidbits, but let's begin with the big players. You've named some of them already, because I didn't realize there was the bottom half of the dozen until I read the book. But
Yeah,
the
the
top
so-called
half,
bottom six. Yeah,
the bottom six,
right.
exactly, the bottom six. And I loved how you filled in on every single one. But let's start with Lee Marvin, because
Sure.
as you said, he was a little bit of a drinker and loved his cigarettes.
that
um
was
when
very
you said
diplomatically,
5 packs a day, I was going, oh my gosh. He
till
was,
the
I
day he
don't,
died.
wow,
Yeah.
crazy.
And he was a drinker. You were very diplomatic in saying he liked drink. He was an alcoholic. There was no
Yeah,
two ways about it.
yeah. But yet continued to work on a regular basis, all the way through, which I had read your book about him and things like that. All
Right.
right, let's go to Charles Bronson, because so many of the lead characters wound up having other careers, and he definitely had a long one.
Yeah. And I'll tell you something. Um, I've always been fascinated by Charles Bronson, except for the concocted Death Wish movies he made. In fact, after I did the Lee Marvin book, I almost did a bio on Charles Bronson. I was contracted with the same publisher, but after a while, we went our separate ways. Bronson, as everybody else in the movie, Bronson's later success was a direct result of the Dirty Dozen. Um, After he made the Dirty Dozen, he stayed in Europe because the movie was filmed in England, the entire film. Um, And he stayed in Europe after he married Jill Ireland, and she thankfully convinced him to make several movies he would otherwise have turned down because he really respected her advice. And one of them was Once Upon a Time in the West, which is a true classic. He did that, I think, shortly after The Dirty Dozen. He did a movie called Rider on the Rain, wonderful, wonderful thriller. Several other films, Cold Sweat, and then he was a monster star in Europe, but strangely enough, not in his own country. Then he came back to America and started making films that, ironically enough, were usually produced in Europe but filmed in the United States. It wasn't until he made films like The Mechanic, Hard Times, and ultimately the first Death Wish movie that he became a true superstar in this country. But that's the fascinating thing about his career. He also, by the way, during the making of The Dirty Dozen, was such a difficult person to get along with because he was very unhappy getting stuck in England when he wanted to marry Jill Ireland, who was British, but ironically enough was making a TV series in the United States. So they were at cross purposes. And so much so that Lee Marvin took to calling Charles Bronson on set Charlie Sunshine because he almost never smiled and he was always in a bad mood, which I thought
Telly
was interesting.
Savalas is another one. Went on to Kojak and so many other great shows. He's,
Oh, you bet.
really TV really gave him the bump.
You bet.
Talk about him too, because he turned out to be
Sure.
quite a character, didn't he?
Oh, yeah, very much so. I love the fact that because he was of Greek background, and so was John Cassavetes, whom I
Yeah.
loved in the movie, that
That's he was the one who I thought I'd get the two Greeks back to back. So
there you go.
Cassavetes, but
Yeah, somebody told me that John Cassavetes and Telly Savalas used to argue on set about where you could get the best Greek food in New York because they're also both New Yorkers. The thing about Telly Savalas that I find interesting, aside from the fact he was a wonderful, wonderful character actor, especially in this film, and let me tell you something he pulled off in this movie, which is fascinating. In the original novel, there were three members of the Dirty Dozen. That one was a religious fanatic, another was a Southern bigot, and another was a
editor
sexual predator. There are there are a
way of
lot of
putting it.
nouns. Yeah, there are a lot of nouns I can use. But
Yeah.
what they did in the movie was they took those three separate characters and they melded them all into the character of Maggot, played by Telly Savalas. And having not read the book at the time, I just found everything he did very believable. I can believe that this guy was a racist, religious sex maniac, you know? And it's brilliant the way he played it. And matter of fact, I love the story. Jim Brown wrote this in his autobiography that when they went to the screening of the movie and when they got to the scene where Jim Brown shoots Telly Savalas was sitting next to Jim Brown. He went, all right, as far as I'm concerned, the movie's over. I got bumped off. Let's get out of here. And he got up and walked away. Which, I think that's pretty cool. He was a fascinating man in many ways. He had a pretty horrific experience in World War II in the Army, but he never spoke about it because that's very common amongst soldiers who experience PTSD. It certainly was true in Lee Marvin's case and others, but
Yeah.
he was very, very, I think he drove an ambulance during the war. I'm not positive. But yeah, his experiences certainly played into the way he played the character. Just fascinating stuff.
All right, John Cassavetes, and then we'll go to Jim Brown.
Sure. John Cassavetes, my personal favorite character and performance in the movie was Cassavetes as Victor Franco. And there's an interesting story there as well about how he came to be in the film. He didn't want to do it. He was dead set against it. But he was also facing a lawsuit and he had been blacklisted in show business, on film anyway, because of a run-in he had with Stanley Kramer, which I go into in the book. Now, Ken Hyman wanted him for The Dirty Dozen, and at the same time, Cassavetes was very much an independent, both as an actor, a writer, and a wonderful director. And he had been trying to finish his own film, but he ran out of money and he couldn't get work. So that's how Ken Hyman talked him into it. He said, look, the lawsuit will be dropped. You can finish your damn movie with the money you get from The Dirty Dozen. Now just do it, John. The way he put it to me was, he goes, Cassavetes was a great actor, wonderful director, a hell of a writer, but he was a great big pain in the ass. It was so hard to get him to agree. But once ultimately he did agree, Cassavetes said it was the best experience he had working with a director. He loved Aldrich. And he did exactly what Ken Hyman suggested. He used the money he got from the Dirty Dozen and finished making the movie he was working on, which eventually became Faces. And that helped create make him what is often been called the father of American independent cinema, because everything pretty much came after him. And he created that way of doing things, and that he might make a movie for somebody else just for the money, like he did. The next film he did was Rosemary's Baby, which he hated because he didn't get along with Roman Polanski, but it wound up financing, Husbands and A Woman Under the Influence, and gosh, all the great Cassavetes films that also led to the American independent film movement. So, I mean, that's another example of how the success of the Dirty Dozen was, other people reaped the rewards of it.
Jim Brown
Oh,
really just
Jim Brown.
had just finished up his career as an NFL star and was
during the
just
during during the making of the movie,
yeah,
which is
they filmed during the off season.
right. Well, it
That's what you
also
said.
yeah, but it also ran long. The movie went over budget and over schedule, and he was contemplating whether or not to quit the NFL. But when he said it was when Art Modell gave him an ultimatum that you either come back for pre-training, or I'm going to sue you and fine you. That when he said, I wasn't really sure what I was going to do, but Jim Brown said, when I got the ultimatum, that did it for me. I don't like ultimatums. So he held the press conference in the middle of the filming of the movie and said he was quitting the NFL. And a lot of people, he was only 29 years old at the time. And, sports writers at the time were all wondering what he was going to do. And when he did it, they were like, oh, he's ruining his career. Turns out it was probably the smartest thing he could have done. Because even though The Dirty Dozen was only his second film, he was so hot from the release of that movie. He signed the contract for 3 more movies, boom, 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 one right after the other, and they were all hits. And from there, he kind of created a brand new popular 70s action film genre called blaxploitation. And he was the hottest thing in it, more than anybody else. And never wanted to be a shrinking violet. Jim Brown liked to say, at least he did in his autobiography, and also in the great documentary that Spike Lee did called Jim Brown All American, where Jim Brown gave credit to Sidney Poitier and what he brought to film as the first major African American film star. And he said, Sidney was great. He opened a lot of doors for us, but Sidney was always a nice guy. Sidney never wanted to do anything that somebody like I would do in a movie. I could be a stud. I could be a tough guy. I could be an action star. And so I took it from there. And by the way, Fred Williamson backed that up. Fred the Hammer Williamson saying that, yeah, me and Jim, we busted those doors down. So, I mean, it's interesting that it was launched through The Dirty Dozen. And unfortunately, we lost him about a month or two ago.
Right.
And
exactly.
what an amazing man of life and career. I just cannot applaud him enough. Also, as a philanthropist and what he did for the African American community within show business and outside of show business. He was quite an accomplished gentleman.
Right. All right. Ernest Borgnine.
Yeah, it's interesting about Borgnine.
Special.
Yeah, Borgnine made the movie because he had a very strong relationship with Robert Aldrich. They had made several movies together. And Borgnine always credited Aldrich with him getting the role and winning the Oscar for Marty. Because in the 50s, when the producers were looking for who could play, he was at a party. The producers were looking for who could play the title role in Marty. Rod Steiger had done it on television, but Steiger was stuck doing Oklahoma, so they had to find somebody else. And Robert Aldrich saw the producer at a party and said, have you guys considered Ernie Borgnine? And they went, no, are you kidding? All he does is play heavies. He's just a big mean guy. And Aldrich told the producers, he said, give him a shot. You'd be surprised at the level of sensitivity he can reach. Now, at the time, Borgnine was making Bad Day at Black Rock. The producers went down to the set of Bad Day at Black Rock. I think it was filmed in Lone Pine. And they asked Borgnine to read a scene from Marty where he's telling his mother that he's always going to, he'll die without a son. I'm a fat, ugly little man. And as Borgnine was reading it, he started to cry himself. And when he stopped reading and said, I'm sorry, he looked at the producers. They were crying. He got the part.
Yeah.
And Borgnine always credited Robert
wonderful
Aldrich.
part.
Oh, heartbreakingly good.
Yeah.
And anytime after that, he was in Flight of the Phoenix, wonderfully so. He was later in The Legend of Lila Claire, another Aldrich film. Just a great compatibility, and Aldrich always respected Borgnine. And as luck would have it, the timing was he was, Ernest Borgnine at the time was filming a TV show, McHale's Navy, and they had to shoot his scenes in a specific window to get when the show was on hiatus, so he could do his scenes where he was the big blustery general. And on the last day of shooting, he shot right back to L.A. and got back into McHale's Navy. So by the time the season was over, he was in the movie theaters with The Dirty Dozen. So that was very fortuitous for him.
Yeah. Clint Walker. Yeah, Clint Walker.
Yeah, I was lucky in that I interviewed Clint Walker 3 times.
What a hunk. Married, not blind.
Yeah, of course not. The old saying, what was it from Seinfeld? It's like, I'm not gay, but if I were, no. The thing about Clint Walker was I interviewed him 3 times, and unfortunately, he had passed away before I started working on the book. But the interviews I got, he spoke a lot about working on The Dirty Dozen and told me some wonderful, wonderful stories that I never knew. And I also, after he had passed away, I got in contact with his daughter, who another fascinating person. She was one of the first commercial licensed airline pilots, and Clint Walker would later say, I've done a lot of things in my life I'm very proud of. The thing I'm most proud of is my daughter, Valerie. And when she heard him say that at some public event, she just broke into tears. And I think that's a wonderful testament to the kind of guy Clint Walker was. He was always referred to as the big fella because he was. And
he and Jim Brown really liked working out together.
Oh, right. Yeah. Oh, and what's interesting too, Muhammad Ali visited the set. Mm-hmm. And Ali and Jim Brown were friends, and they used to work out in the morning. That they'd run together in the morning because Ali was in town for a title fight in London, which he won, by the way, not surprisingly. But yeah, and they were all these guys. I mean, guys like this. Yeah, Donald Sutherland, Jim Brown. I just want
Clint Walker.
Yeah, Clint Walker. Thank you, and a couple of others. They were big guys, okay? Yeah, and on the first day of shooting, to prove that Robert Aldrich was not all just business, the first day of shooting, they had that shot in the beginning of the movie where all the dozen are lined up and Lee Marvin is going through them, okay? Robert Aldrich got to Clint Walker and Jim Brown and Donald Sutherland, all of whom are well over 6 feet tall, to stand in line, and he got Bronson to stand in between them. Now, Bronson... not a tall man, and when he would rehearse, he'd wear boxing shoes, and that made him even shorter. He wasn't wearing combat boots, and he looked at his right, he looked at his left, and when he saw that they were standing there like that, he with this, the crew was laughing, and it took another 10 minutes to get the shot right because Aldrich himself couldn't stop laughing. It was such a funny sight to see them like that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, listen, we're running out of time. But we have to talk about the bottom dozen, which included George Kennedy, which I was kind of surprised about. He was like one of those late ones, huh?
Oh, well, George Kennedy wasn't one of the dozen. He was one of the officers that was overseeing the dozen. Mm-hmm. He had said he wanted to play Maggot. That was the part he wanted.
Really?
And Robert Aldrich paid him a great compliment. He said, "Look, George, I can get you to play Maggot, but I can't get Telly Savalas to do what I need you to do in the part of Armbruster. So play Armbruster." And George Kennedy said, "I like that he said that." So I did. He played Armbruster. Now, of the bottom 6, the most prominent was probably Donald Sutherland. Okay, but
I'm surprised about that. Yeah.
I was lucky. I got to interview him. He just had a birthday about 2 or 3 days ago. He's 88 years old, still going strong, still working. Mm-hmm. I also interviewed a gentleman named Colin Maitland, who was one of the bottom dozen, who only had a couple of lines. And he's still around. He's a retired sports reporter from the BBC. A lot of the bottom dozen were either British or Canadian in England because they had cast most of the major stars in America. But when they got to England, they realized they had some more parts they had to fill. So they scouted around real quick and were able to find them. And who else did I interview? Oh, yeah, there was a gentleman named, and I love telling people this, a guy named
Carruthers.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, I'm so glad you remembered. You did your homework. Ben Carruthers. Now, Ben Carruthers passed away, but his son a gentleman named Kane Carruthers gave me one of my favorite quotes. Ben Carruthers was a part-time actor, part-time musician, and rather a legend in show business. He hung out with Mick Jagger and Bob Dylan, and also made underground independent films. He worked with John Cassavetes and Cassavetes' first film, Shadows. But here's the thing about Ben Carruthers: he was a light-skinned black man, and consequently, he could play Hispanics, he could play Greeks, Italians, Arabs, Indians, sometimes blacks. And Kane Carruthers, his son, was much darker. And when he would tell anybody that his father was in the Dirty Dozen, they all responded the same way. They would go, "Oh wow, you're Jim Brown's
Brown.
son?" No, he wasn't. But I mean, he also said the first time he saw the movie, that wonderfully harrowing scene when his father gets his foot stuck in the roof and he can't get it out, and the grenade has already been set. He said the first time he saw that movie, he was 6 years old, and he goes, "I screamed and ran out of the room." He goes, "I couldn't believe that was my dad."
Yeah,
You know, that's the effect movies have on people. But like I said, I
exactly.
interviewed Ben Carruthers' son, Colin Maitland, a guy named Stuart Cooper, who went on to become a great film director in his own right. So I was able to get great stories from everybody, from the top to the bottom.
So you did a great job on this book. I would recommend it to everybody.
Oh,
Okay, Dwayne, so where can we get the book?
I'm glad you asked that. It's available on Amazon, and as a hardcover or a Kindle, or also as an audio if you'd like to just drive around and listen to it. But it's also available at Barnes and Noble, and I believe it is available wherever fine books are sold. And if you can't find it at a neighborhood bookstore, be it Barnes and Noble or any other place, ask for it, and they'll order it for you.
Right. Um, and what kind of words would you like to leave with people and what you think about the movie?
Well, I'll tell you, before I do that, and I'll make it real quick, I'm just very, very glad that you are as interested in what we're talking about than anybody else. I've been told from the very beginning that the core demographic for a book about the Dirty Dozen is usually baby boomer males, and that would be pretty much it. And your interest in this is proving them wrong. You're a wonderful, well-read African American woman, which is not the demographic I was told would be interested in this book, but you're proving them wrong, and thank you for that. That said, I would like, I've been asked that question before, and some people would like to tell me, "Boy, I can't wait to see the movie again, and then I'll read your book." And I'll tell people, do yourself a favor, read the book first, then watch the movie, because you'll be able to look for things you hadn't thought of looking for previously. And I have several examples of that. But basically, yeah, find the book, read it, and then watch the movie, and you'll see it in a whole new light.
It's true. Very, very true. It's very entertaining. I love getting the tidbits from behind the scenes. And then
Oh,
also the
thank
way
you.
you wrap it up with the lives and how they ended too was also very interesting. And
Oh, thank you.
like you said, they so many of them went on to really become stars, their own shows. There are many different movies and things like that. And with John Cassavetes, I mean, you're really talking about a tremendous career who gave so many other people opportunities. So
That's right.
thank you. It was
Oh,
absolutely wonderful.
my pleasure.
All right. Well, many
Absolutely my
thanks.
pleasure.
Oh, truly. Many thanks to New York Times bestselling author Dwayne Epstein. His latest book, Killing Generals: The Making of the Dirty Dozen, the most iconic World War II movie of all time, is a great read and available everywhere, as he said, Barnes& and Noble, Amazon. And if you don't see it, you should ask for it. More on Dwayne on Facebook and Twitter at Dwayne Epstein. Until next time, seek peace and spread lots of love. I'm Maggie Linton.
Thank you. Very well done.